As a people, we Americans are generally problem solvers. Our history is one of confronting and overcoming challenges, and that is especially true with respect to threats to our freedoms and our security. Time and again, generation after generation of American patriots have heeded the call to protect this country and its people from ideologically driven and other dangers. We must now do so once again if the United States is to defeat the most serious and imminent of such dangers in our time, the Islamist doctrine of Sharia and the efforts of its adherents to impose it worldwide on Muslims and non-Muslims alike through violent means or by stealth. This final part of our course offers insights into ways in which we can all help do just that.
The urgency of such efforts was only increased by the visit conducted in early April 2012 by an official delegation of the Egyptian Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party. This tour was characterized by the Washington Post as a, quote, charm offensive, unquote. It was mounted by skilled Brotherhood operatives who met with Obama administration officials, legislators, the press, and policy organizations like the Al-Walid bin Talal Center for Muslim-Christian Understanding. In a number of these interactions, they were embraced by fellow Islamist leftists and others who Lenin would have described as useful idiots, individuals uninformed and or unconcerned about the true toxic nature of the Ikhwan to the U.S. Constitution, government, and free society. A discordant note in the midst of this charm offensive roadshow was the announcement by a top Egyptian brother, Khairat el-Shatar, that he would run for president as the candidate of the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party. He will likely be an influential force in Egypt, even if he is ultimately precluded from standing for office. The accelerating progress of the Muslim Brotherhood in making inroads here, even as it consolidates power in Egypt and promotes elsewhere what el-Shatar calls the Islamic Renaissance or Nada project, demands an urgent and effective American effort to protect the true freedom and justice of the kind enshrined in our Constitution.
فهذه الثورة التي حدثت في مصر وتحدث في الدول المحيطة بنا الآن مما لا شك فيه تمثل لحظة تاريخية، تمثل مرحلة كبيرة أو مرحلة جديدة، تمثل تحول تاريخي كبير لابد ان احنا نستفيد منه كإخوان وتستفيد منه الأمة بأسرها إن شاء الله تعالى. تعلمون جميعا أن مهمتنا الأساسية والإجمالية كإخوان مسلمين هي التمكين لدين الله عز وجل في الأرض، هي تنظيم حياتنا وحياة الناس على أساس الإسلام، هي بناء نهضة الأمة وحضارتها على أساس الإسلام، هي تعبيد الناس لله في الأرض. كل هذه مترادفات بتؤدي نفس المعنى. تعالي في كل مكان يعملون على إعادة الإسلام بمفهومه الشامل إلى حياة الناس، وآمنوا أن هذا لا يتأتى إلا من خلال الجماعة القوية. فإذا المهمة واضحة، إعادة الإسلام بمفهومه الشامل لحياة الناس، تعبيد الناس لله، إقامة دين الله، أسلمة الحياة، التمكين لدين الله، بناء نهضة الأمة على أساس الإسلام. إذا الجماعة أداة وليست هدف بعيد المدى، ولكنها أداة أو وسيلة لأسلمة الحياة ككل، لإقامة الدين زي ما قال سيدنا عمر. وبالتالي ده جزء من الثوابت اللي احنا مؤمنين بيه كإخوان. الأداة الرئيسية لتنفيذ هذا المشروع هي الجماعة وليست الحزب، وليست أي وسيلة أخرى أو أداة أخرى، ولكن الجماعة. لأنه اللي بيدرس فقه إقامة الدين كما أسسه وأصله سيدنا محمد عليه الصلاة والسلام.
If we are to counter such a threat, Americans who cherish our liberties must now act at three levels. First, through individual initiatives. Second, together with other like-minded individuals in a coherent, organized effort. And third, through measures we must take as a nation. Let's consider examples of the sorts of things that can and must be done at each of these levels. The most immediate way in which each of us can make a difference is by taking personal responsibility for countering Sharia. To be sure, doing so takes courage and a willingness to run afoul not only of the Islamists, but of their apologists and enablers among non-Muslim Americans. Given the stakes, however, not just for us, but for our children and grandchildren, we must all do our part. Here are some specific practical steps that individuals can and need to take. The obvious but crucial first step is to ensure that you are informed. Here's a scary thought. Just by taking this course, you've already become more knowledgeable than most U.S. government officials and legislators about the threat posed by Sharia and the jihad it impels, of both the violent and stealthy kinds. And by taking this course, you join the thousands of Americans who have started to educate themselves about Sharia. You've learned, for example, that Sharia is a totalitarian and supremacist doctrine, a program its adherents believe must control all aspects of life, from the personal pietistic practice of Islam to global governance, of not only Muslims but non-Muslims as well. You've also heard that millions and millions of Muslims around the world, including most in this country, do not practice Islam in accordance with Sharia. That's the good news. The bad news is that, as we've discussed, those Muslims are under great and growing pressure to conform to Sharia's dictates and to join Islamists who seek to impose that doctrine on everyone else. And you've learned how we can either help such Muslims resist and overcome that pressure, or, alternatively, do things that will encourage many of them to succumb to it. You've also become knowledgeable about the nature and supremacist purposes of the preeminent international organization of such Islamists, the Muslim Brotherhood. You've learned that from its inception, the Brotherhood has been a disciplined, organized, and ruthless group rooted in the Salafist traditions of Sharia-adherent Islam. And you've seen how the Muslim Brothers have sought, throughout their organization's history, to advance two goals. First, to promote and secure the triumph of Sharia around the world, and second, to reconstitute the Caliphate, to rule the planet in accordance with Sharia. Finally, you've studied in considerable detail the Muslim Brotherhood's pursuit of these twin goals through civilization jihad in America, so as to destroy Western civilization from within by our hands and the hands of Sharia's adherents. The website for this course offers a wealth of resources that can further equip you to do your part to counter the Islamists and their friends' civilization jihad, including an accessible, authoritative rendering of Sharia called Reliance of the Traveler. Check them all out at MuslimBrotherhoodinAmerica.com. Secondly, your effectiveness in countering Sharia will be greatly enhanced if you're not only knowledgeable about it, but trained in how best to address this threat to our country. We've seen how much effort the Islamists are making to deny our government effective training about such threats. It's therefore all the more important that we as individual citizens get the kinds of training in recognizing and countering civilization jihad that the Obama administration is currently putting off limits to those charged with protecting us at home and abroad. This training is particularly required if we are to contend with Muslim brothers who have been rigorously prepared to wage stealthy jihad against us and our country. We're up against skilled professionals like Tariq Ramadan, Brotherhood founder Hassan al-Banna's grandson, and his counterparts at the Ikhwan's fronts like CARE, ISNA, MPAC, ICNA, and IIIT. They know precisely how important it is to keep us witless, and will use every trick available to them, from taqiyya about their agendas to slandering those of us who oppose them, to threats of violence, at least by others, if we persist. If you're going to go up against the Islamists, you have to know not only the truth about Sharia, but how to parry efforts by them to suppress that truth in order to bring it here. You'll also find some tips about how to go about getting trained at www.muslimbrotherhoodinamerica.com. As you become versed in recognizing the stealthy jihad against our country and skilled in countering its operatives, you'll want to develop a support network to sustain you in your own efforts and to build capacity in waging the counter-jihad. The obvious place to start is with people closest to you, relatives, folks in your neighborhood, and those you work with. The more in command of the facts you are, the easier it will be to engage such people and to equip them to understand the dangers posed in and to our country by the Islamists and their friends. Your study and training will prepare you for a variety of responses. Expect that some of those you approach will dismiss your warnings or simply refuse to hear what you have to say. Let's face it, denying an unpleasant truth is much easier than confronting it, since once persuaded of a present danger to ourselves, to our loved ones, to our community, most of us will probably feel compelled to do something about it. It'll be particularly tempting for some to default to the comforting disinformation and taqiyya of the enemy, or the willful blindness of our government. They may, as a result, insist we only have to be worried about Al-Qaeda or perhaps other violent extremists. At a minimum, they may simply fear being branded an Islamophobe or racist and find it easier to see you as such, as a pretext for not addressing the information you're sharing with them. Don't be too harsh on these folks, especially if you have to live or work with them. Be patient. They may get it over time, especially as the malevolence of the Muslim Brotherhood and its allies becomes more unmistakable elsewhere. For the moment, it will probably be enough to impress upon them what the Brotherhood civilization jihad has in store for us here, and what that will mean for the America we will leave to our children and grandchildren. Keep networking, and you'll find others who are more open to information about the Islamist threats to our schools, courts, government, etc. It may surprise you to discover that some of those who get the threat most and who are most open to learning more about it are women. That may be because they are particularly concerned about their children and communities, or it may be because they do not like how their sex is treated under Sharia. They're a natural constituency and need to be empowered by you and your support system. Another key group you need to expose to your knowledge and concerns about civilization jihad are those who represent you at every level of government. You have the right to ask those who represent you and those charged with public safety to learn what you have discovered about the civilization jihad, why you're concerned, and that you will hold them accountable. Remind them that they took an oath of office that pledged their loyalty to the Constitution and that they have a responsibility to know if there are present and emerging threats to it. Here are some basic tips for getting started. Reach out to those public servants who work for you. The more local, the better, as they will be the easiest for you to contact. Describe to them your concerns about what this form of seditious activity will mean for your community. But don't stop with your town, city, or county council. Make sure your state and federal representatives are also invited to hear what you've learned. Don't decline an invitation to talk to their staff. That's often the most effective way to bring officials up to speed. It's usually an indispensable first step to engaging their bosses. Be sure to do that too, especially at a time when a representative is seeking your vote. You have a reasonable chance of making them think about and respond to your concerns. Make a point of contacting as well officials who may or may not be in elective positions, but whose responsibilities for public safety give them a need to know what you have learned. As with your outreach efforts to fellow citizens, expect some pushback, especially from those who have partnered with Muslim Brotherhood front organizations or are following guidelines from federal agencies that have done so. Be polite, but resolute. Share with them this course, the Team B2 report, and any other resources you have found helpful at the Muslim Brotherhood in America website or elsewhere. Make an effort to amplify your voice by challenging media outlets to cover and expose the civilization jihad. Focus on the opportunities that social networking media afford to communicate what you have learned and to inform others. It's worth working the other traditional media as well, even though, as we've seen, the Society of Professional Journalists has, for over a decade, effectively encouraged its members to submit to the Islamists' information dominance. In the final analysis, there's only so much that we can do as individuals. It's important that we do those things, but then, if possible, that we join forces with others in a larger support network. Your impact in countering Sharia and the civilization jihad will be maximized if you're part of an effective team. You can achieve strength in numbers fastest by becoming part of one or more of the myriad terrific groups already working to counter Sharia. A list of some of them can be found at MuslimBrotherhoodinAmerica.com. Of these, several are national organizations, others are regional or state-based. But even the bigger groups often have local activists. There may already be somebody working on these issues in your community. By joining them, you may be able to avoid reinventing the wheel. Learning from their experiences, good and bad, will make you more effective faster. That's not just desirable, it's imperative, given the tremendous head start our enemies have. Alternatively, if you have good organizational skills, a lot of drive, and a core team of like-minded folks, you may want to start your own effort if you see a task nobody else is doing and that needs to be done. Even in that case, please make a point of learning as much as you can from others already in the fight, so as to minimize duplication of effort and avoid common mistakes that dissipate energy urgently needed in the counter-jihad. And whenever possible, partner up with other organizations to get big things accomplished. As we've discussed, if we're to counter the organized, disciplined, and systematic civilization jihad in America, our countrymen are going to have to be every bit as serious about building infrastructure, working together, and pursuing in a strategic way a comprehensive counter-Sharia campaign to keep this country Sharia-free. Let's turn now to the sorts of counter-Sharia initiatives that such organized groups of Americans can effectively mount. One place to start in such a comprehensive campaign is by recalling the various techniques we learned about in Part 2 of this course, techniques that the civilization jihadists are using to destroy us from within, by our hands. Each of these must be countered, and groups' organized efforts can make a huge contribution to doing so effectively. As with individuals, the prerequisite of awakening much larger numbers of our countrymen and women to the danger we face is to find efficient ways to inform them and rouse them to join in mounting the needed corrective measures. It's essential that organized efforts, like those by individuals, be grounded in a mastery of the facts. After all, the Muslim Brotherhood and their friends are trained to seize upon and exploit any misstep, especially those that play into the Islamists' false narratives of victimhood in the face of rampant Islamophobia and phony claims that Muslims are being denied the right to practice their religion. Remember what you've learned in this course and use it to help others become more knowledgeable too. The Islamists' Sharia is really about power, faith. Marshal your facts. Make sure that others speaking on your behalf and representing your organization maintain message discipline, and you'll have a decisive impact in the counter-jihad. As we've seen, the civilization jihadists are determined to impose what amount to their blasphemy laws upon us by prohibiting our freedom of speech if it offends them. We can't let them get away with such an assault on our Constitution and rights. Even in the absence of the sort of formal ban the Organization of Islamic Cooperation is trying to get the Obama administration to establish here, the Islamists want to use our civil liberties, specifically freedom of religion, and the coercive power of political correctness to silence any criticism of what is, in fact, a seditious power grab. Our approach to free expression in the face of civilization jihad must be informed by a few basic principles. First, the reason the Muslim Brotherhood and the other Islamists seek to dictate what we can say and can't say is that they understand our submission to their blasphemy laws is a major step towards America's dhimmitude. Second, Muslims who came to America to escape Sharia, or who do not choose to adhere to its intolerant, supremacist doctrine are able to practice their faith in a tolerant, peaceable, and law-abiding way. They have the constitutional right to do so and should be afforded the same rights and treatment as Christians, Jews, and people of other faith. No more, but no less. Third, Muslims who demand preferential treatment, for example, with respect to what can be said to and about them, where and when they can practice their faith, in terms of making charitable donations in the form of zakat that violate our laws on material support for terrorism, etc., are not entitled to it. In fact, they're engaged in civilization jihad and must be resisted, not accommodated. As we discussed a moment ago, every opportunity should be seized to engage in free expression in the media, in particular the new social networking outlets. Creative messages and images, particularly ones that use humor to devastating effect, can go viral, affording a visibility that until recently only immense amounts of money could buy. While many in the traditional or mainstream media can be part of the problem, there are still some publications, editors, columnists, and television hosts who will lend a sympathetic ear to the well-researched and forcefully argued positions of groups challenging the Muslim Brotherhood. Seek them out and find ways to connect with these potential allies. Organizations that have developed a reputation for knowing their stuff and presenting it in a media-savvy way generally have a better chance of getting the ears of such influential amplifiers. Another reason for joining forces with them. Not least, do what you can, in a responsible way, to hold accountable media organizations, reporters, usually ones with the religion beater among the worst, editors, talk show hosts, and so on, for covering or giving airtime to known Muslim Brotherhood front organizations like CARE, ISNA, and MPAC, and for failing to report on their civilization jihad. Countering the stealth jihad in American education is particularly important. That's especially so since the domination of academia by the left makes it extremely susceptible to the sort of red-green collusion that we've seen operates to such insidious effect elsewhere. Resisting dawah in our schools also lends itself to team and coalition-building efforts, as parents, and most especially mothers, tend to be eager and willing to protect their children from efforts to submit them to civilization jihadist proselytization. Let's look at some of the principles that should guide such resistance. First, no faith should be given preferential treatment in American public education. Second, that equal treatment must extend to the characterization of faiths in textbooks and other materials used in teaching and testing students. Finally, teaching about Islam must address the totality of Islam, including the nature and role of Sharia in the practice of their faith by some, but not all, Muslims. Christian, Jewish, and other faith communities have a special responsibility to help counter civilization jihad. After all, Muslim Brotherhood efforts to enlist leaders of other faith traditions provides political cover and helps undermine rival religious communities. This is especially true of those clerics and congregations of other faiths who have been induced to embrace Muslim Brotherhood organizations, mosques, and agendas. As we've seen, such agendas include, for example, endorsing the Ground Zero Mosque, countering the fabricated phenomenon of Islamophobia, and allowing Sharia-adherent Muslims the use and consecration to Allah of their religious facilities. The obvious and most effective counterweight to clerics' well-intentioned but uninformed and dangerous participation in the Islamists' one-way bridge building is opposition from their congregations. Every effort should, therefore, be made to educate people of faith about the civilization jihad in America, and particularly those ministered by pastors and rabbis who are enabling it. To varying degrees, though, other religious and even secular organizations can contribute to a course correction by such faith leaders if done in a respectful way and on the basis of well-documented facts. The U.S. government should not be in the business of abetting financial arrangements and institutions that promote Sharia and its insinuation into this country. If anything, It's in the national interest for the federal government and its state and local counterparts to discourage Sharia-compliant finance. Counter-jihad organizations should make a focus of their efforts opposing the use of taxpayer funds, guarantees, or other forms of official legitimation and support for Sharia financial activities. Where you find such activities afoot, publicize them and find out how your group can get them defunded or otherwise blocked. A model and important test case is a federal lawsuit against the U.S. government's ownership of AIG, which is, as we have seen, the largest purveyor of Sharia-compliant insurance products in the world. As established in the course of the lawsuit's discovery phase, over $1 billion in U.S. taxpayer funds went directly to AIG's Sharia division in the September 2008 bailout. Counter-Sharia organizations should also bring pressure to bear on private sector financial institutions to reject involvement in the enabling of what Sheikh Yusuf al-Qaradawi has called jihad with money. For more information about how Sharia-compliant finance works to legitimate and help fund civilization and even violent jihad, the sort of information you'll need to go head-to-head with a seemingly lucrative and powerful industry, see the resources at MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com. Numerous organizations determined to counter the further penetration of Sharia into the United States have understood the importance of the American courts in the civilization jihad. They've understood that while Sharia is a particularly toxic example of foreign laws hostile to our Constitution and the rights it guarantees, it's just one of many being introduced into American jurisprudence. Pursuant to its Article 6, the U.S. Constitution must prevail where there might be any conflict with other foreign laws, including Sharia. That assuredly has to be the case where fundamental rights are involved, including those of women and children who do not enjoy the same liberties under Sharia that they do in our constitutional republic. Such groups have joined forces across the country to support the legislative initiative known as American Laws for American Courts. A copy of this model legislation can be found at MuslimBrotherhoodInAmerica.com. 3 states have already adopted versions of this model, and its constitutionality has yet to be challenged in court. Because it serves as an important bulwark against Sharia, among other anti-constitutional foreign laws, it's being strenuously fought by the Muslim Brotherhood and its allies. Check out the website's links to organizations that are fighting to ensure that American laws govern in your state's courts, and lend them your support. This course has presented myriad examples of officials in various agencies and legislatures across the country who are failing to counter and, in some cases, are actually aiding and abetting the civilization jihad being waged in America by the Muslim Brotherhood and its allies. They must be held accountable for such behavior and discouraged from engaging in it in the future. Counter-Sharia groups and organizations can help enormously in achieving such behavior modification. As we've seen, the Muslim Brotherhood's explanatory memorandum and phased plan for its execution place a priority on penetrating America's civil society and governmental institutions as part of its civilization jihad. No less a priority must be placed on countering such subversive operations. It is absolutely imperative that elected officials and other leaders be challenged about what may be, at best, their ignorance about Sharia, the Muslim Brotherhood, and the stealthy as well as violent forms of jihad in which the Ikhwan and its friends engage for the purposes of our destruction. At worst, they are an even bigger part of the problem because of their active support for those perpetrating the civilization jihad, and/or their enablers like Grover Norquist. In short, we must get to the bottom of the civilization jihad in America, fully exposing its seditious goals and the extent to which they are being achieved here. The U.S. government has various mechanisms, including congressional investigative capabilities and judicial processes, to illuminate the enemy within and, where necessary, to initiate corrective action. This country's citizens and counter-jihad organizations can play a critical role in inspiring, informing, and ensuring quality control in the performance of such mechanisms, especially if effective use is made of new and traditional media to amplify their message and maximize their influence. Finally, let's consider the sorts of steps that Americans must take as a nation if we are to ensure the survival of our constitutional republic in the face of the Muslim Brotherhood and its concerted efforts to impose Sharia here by destroying us from within. These are illustrative examples of the sorts of measures that would make a difference. Many more could be mentioned and should be undertaken. These represent good places to start, however. Let's review each in turn. Typically, office holders across the land take oaths of office. These amount to solemn, unqualified, and open-ended pledges to conform to and protect the Constitution of the United States. Implied is an obligation made explicit in many such oaths sworn at the federal level, namely, a promise to safeguard that foundational document against all enemies, foreign and domestic. In light of the widespread and voluntary acceptance of such an oath by our officials, there is an obvious and strong basis for demanding that they fulfill it with respect to the enemy within, the Muslim Brotherhood and other Islamists. Put simply, if our officials will simply do what they have promised to do, the job of countering civilization jihad will be made considerably easier. Specifically, to the extent that our elected and appointed officials live up to their promises, by wielding the power of their offices effectively, they can make a very appreciable contribution to the outcome of what might best be described as the war for the free world. Remember, they are obliged to do so under oath. The first step is for our leaders to know the enemy we face in that war, the Muslim Brotherhood, and others who seek to impose Sharia here and elsewhere. As the Joint Chiefs of Staff's former expert on this threat, U.S. Army Reserve's Major Stephen Coughlin observes, this is not something that is simply desirable. Officials with responsibility for national and homeland security, law enforcement, and public safety have a professional duty to know. Just as a doctor, lawyer, or other professional has the responsibility to master their chosen profession to an objective standard of competence, the government's national security practitioners have an obligation to know the enemy and be aware of the threat. Next, our leaders must inventory what they can do, using the powers of their respective offices to counter our enemies. Finally, they must use those powers to decisive effect. Under the circumstances, nothing less will do to fulfill their public promise. Next, it's past due that the State Department or Congress move swiftly to formally recognize the very real ideological threat posed by the Muslim Brotherhood. From what we've seen in previous parts of this course, the Obama administration is unwilling to do this. As a nation, Americans therefore must demand this of their representatives in government, to take up this task in the United States Congress. It would obviously greatly facilitate both public understanding of the danger posed by the Muslim Brotherhood and the needed marshaling of government resources to counter it if the organization were officially designated as a threat. It's possible to designate the Brotherhood as a terrorist organization on the grounds that its Palestinian franchise, Hamas, has already been designated as such. There is a precedent. The so-called People's Mujahideen of Iran, or MEK, has, like the Muslim Brotherhood's Palestinian branch, Hamas, been officially designated as a terrorist organization. That same designation was applied to the MEK's umbrella group, the National Council of Resistance of Iran. Thus, the designation of Hamas as a terrorist group should apply as well to its parent, the Muslim Brotherhood. This connection gets around the argument that the U.S. government currently defines as terrorists only groups that are currently engaged in violence, not merely supportive of it when practicable. But the Muslim Brotherhood should qualify, since even as it promotes itself as nonviolent, while cultivating relations with sympathetic segments of the U.S. government, think tanks, and the press, it has clearly allowed its subsidiary branch, Hamas, to engage in violent terrorist acts. Alternatively, the Brotherhood could be identified as a hostile foreign power. This is appropriate, since, as we have seen, the nature and mission of the Brotherhood is indisputably hostile to America. Either way, U.S. tax dollars should not be made available to the Brotherhood. It is, for example, simply outrageous that Secretary of State Hillary Clinton on March 22, 2012, waived restrictions imposed by Congress on military assistance to the Muslim Brotherhood-dominated government of Egypt, Worse yet, in a departure from normal practice, the Obama administration made the full $1.5 billion available at once, without conditions. There should be another clear benefit from designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a threat. So-called Muslim community leaders associated with the Brotherhood must be deemed ineligible for official outreach or collaboration with government or law enforcement. Even in the absence of such a designation, individuals with well-documented ties to the Muslim Brotherhood, other Sharia-promoting organizations, and or Islamist agendas, for example, Niad Awad, Muzamil Siddiqui, Kifa Mustafa, Mohammed Ali Biari, Mohammed Majid, and Salam al-Mariyati, should not be used by U.S. government or other official entities as liaisons to the American Muslim community. The need to know the enemy demands, of course, that the training provided to those responsible for defending us against our foes be fact and reality-based, not governed by political correctness or, more to the point, by submission to Sharia and its adherents. We can no longer indulge in the willful blindness pressed upon the George W. Bush 2000 campaign and administration by Grover Norquist and his Islamist cohort, or tolerate the willing submission of the Obama administration to Muslim Brotherhood demands and those of its friends. Our submission to the Islamists' information dominance initiatives must urgently be reversed. To do so as a nation, we're going to have to apply certain principles and practices. First, government at every level must recognize the ground truth. We confront Sharia-impelled jihad, not just terrorism or violent extremism. The national objective from now on must be to counter both the violent and pre-violent jihadists and their efforts to destroy America, irrespective of whether they seek that end through overt, terrifying means or via stealth. To proceed from now on solely on the basis of facts, rooted in a clear-eyed assessment of the threat, we need those charged with protecting us to understand what motivates our enemies, in their own words, delivered for consumption by Muslim, not infidel audiences. These motivations, rather than on the one hand taqiyya, and on the other sociological theories that project our worldview and preoccupations onto the enemy, need to find their way into official lexicons, threat assessments, and strategies used by law enforcement, the military, and other national security professionals. At the risk of stating the obvious, trainers charged with equipping those responsible for defending us from all enemies, foreign and domestic, need to reflect this understanding of the threat, as must their training materials. Similarly, Muslim brothers and other enemy operatives should have no part in the preparation or approval of either the trainers or training materials used to equip Americans to counter such foes. There are a number of areas where federal legislators could help erect barriers to the insinuation of Sharia and its adherents into this country. This is a list of a few illustrative examples. It's worth spending a minute on each of these initiatives. Quite sensibly, the U.S. government has seen fit to deny government jobs and military service to those who seek the destruction of the nation. Once the Muslim Brotherhood has been designated a threat, much as the Communist Party was, this would necessitate individuals and groups associated with it from being barred from official contact with the U.S. government. Obviously, it would also preclude its members from serving in government office or in the military. For example, according to guidelines developed by the Department of Defense, quote, for use by the U.S. government security community, unquote, grounds for exclusion from government employment include, quote, association or sympathy with persons or organizations that advocate, threaten, or use force or use any other illegal or unconstitutional means in an effort to overthrow or influence the government of the United States or any state or local government, unquote. Here are a few other grounds for exclusion. Quote, advocacy of any act of sedition against the United States of America or association or sympathy with those attempting to commit or who are committing sedition, unquote. Quote, association with persons or organizations attempting to commit sedition, unquote. And association with those who advocate preventing, quote, others from exercising their rights under the Constitution, unquote. These eminently sensible rules must be applied to Muslim Brothers and other Islamists and deny them the opportunity to penetrate the U.S. armed forces and civilian office in the security community, or for that matter, in any other official capacity. After all, individuals with such proclivities and associations cannot be expected honestly to take on, let alone fulfill, the obligations of their oath of office. Nor will they do so, and the implications for U.S. security in the face of their civilization jihad can be potentially devastating. Next, Americans must make it clear that they don't want their tax money involved in the participation or promotion of Sharia-compliant financial transactions. The First Amendment to the U.S. Constitution's Establishment Clause has long been interpreted to prevent the federal government from giving any religion preferred status or other favored treatment. The U.S. Treasury and Federal Reserve are being sued on behalf of a Michigan veteran named Kevin Murray by Team B2 member David Yerushalmi and Robert Muse, two of our nation's most skilled litigators. Messrs. Yerushalmi and Muse co-founded in January 2012 a new public interest law firm, the American Freedom Law Center, to protect the U.S. Constitution, religious freedom, and their exponents in the face of Sharia's onslaught. Whatever the outcome of the lawsuit challenging the constitutionality of U.S. ownership of AIG, legislation is in order that would bar the U.S. government from owning or otherwise participating in financial practices that give preferential treatment to a single faith. A legislative prohibition on such preferential treatment for financial practices that at least masquerade as religious in character should be considered by Congress. That should apply most especially to a faith that, as Sharia finance authority Youssef al-Qaradawi knows well, directs, according to Sharia, a portion of the proceeds of such financial practices to be used for what amounts to material support for terrorism. It's not just unconstitutional, it is madness for the U.S. government to be facilitating in any way, let alone underwriting, an industry that its own leaders say is waging jihad with money. Another legislative initiative Americans must take on as a nation is the prevention of preferential treatment of and for Sharia practices or its adherents. As we've previously discussed, there are many examples of concessions the civilization jihadists have been wringing out of state and local governments and private sector entities. The federal government may or may not have a role in precluding such favoritism at those levels. It certainly can establish the principle that it is inconsistent with the intent of the framers of the Constitution and thereby, at a minimum, discourage it. This would include concessions like footbaths and prayer rooms in public spaces at taxpayer expense, the Muslim holiday of Eid as a paid holiday, Muslims getting time off for prayers and for making the religious pilgrimage of the Hajj enshrined as a rite, the building of triumphalist mosques or Islamic centers like the one at Ground Zero in New York, cabbies refusing service to the blind as Sharia considers their seeing eye dogs unclean. This course has documented how the threat posed by the Muslim Brotherhood civilization jihad is being compounded by the continuing admission into this country as visitors or permanent residents of still more Sharia-adherent Muslims, including Saudi-trained imams and unassimilable refugee populations. Attorney James Edwards, a fellow of the Center for Immigration Studies, noted in September 2005 in a Center white paper entitled Keeping Extremists Out, The History of Ideological Exclusion and the Need for Its Revival, that there is ample precedent for excluding would-be visitors or permanent residents who adhere to Sharia's seditious doctrine. As Mr. Edwards put it, quote, excluding and removing aliens who exhibited unwanted characteristics has been traditional American practice. Whether by colonial, state, or federal governments, the right to exclude and deport non-citizens has been vigorously exercised in this nation. Indeed, such a right is inherent to the idea of a sovereign nation." Unquote. Most recently, during the Cold War, the U.S. government recognized the danger of admitting not just members of the Communist Party, but individuals, quote, in any way connected or associated, unquote, with it. It restricted their admission under a statute known as the McCarran-Walter Act of 1950. What is more, that act barred those who, quote, ever knowingly aided or supported the Communist Party directly or indirectly through another organization, unquote. This is a critically important precedent because of the analogous situation that exists today with respect to the myriad Muslim Brotherhood front groups who have modeled their subversive penetration of our civil society institutions and government on Soviet communist tradecraft. The same logic should apply to those today who adhere to a no less seditious ideology that some have dubbed communism with a god. Notably, organizations like CARE, ISNA, MPAC, and others bear a strong resemblance to the multitude of Communist Party front groups employed by the Soviets during the Cold War, and their division of labor in undermining the United States from within. The bottom line is that we must not continue the practice of admitting, let alone inviting in, enemies of this country whose adherence to Sharia obliges them to seek our submission and destruction. As we've seen, Sharia-adherent mosques are multi-use facilities for their imams and congregants. Unfortunately, from Muhammad's time onwards, mosques have served as more than houses of worship. Here's a quote from an authoritative history of these institutions entitled Mosque in Islam. The mosque was, quote, the Parliament House, the University, the Army Headquarters, and the Prison House, all at the same time, unquote. Sharia expert Andrew Boston reminds us that one of President Obama's favorite Islamists, Turkish Prime Minister Recep Tayyip Erdogan, frequently makes use of imagery melded into what was originally a secular nationalist paean to the military. As we've learned, two studies, one a 2007 analysis by two senior analysts in the New York Police Department's Intelligence Division, Mitchell Silber and Arvin Bhatt, and the other, a 2011 investigation by Mordecai Kedar and David Yerushalmi, have documented an alarming fact. Sharia-adherent mosques in this country are being used to promote and, in some cases, train for jihad. The United States must not allow mosques to be used as platforms for sedition. To the extent that imams and their facilities are being used to advocate Sharia in America, they are promoting seditious activity, which is against the law. And the law in the land must be enforced. If necessary, it must be amended to ensure that it is not possible for institutions to get away with engaging in seditious activity simply by presenting themselves as religious in character. No-go zones are enclaves where a foreign and unassimilated population essentially excludes all others and establishes hostile environments into which the local or national governments fear to assert their authority or even enter. As a nation, we need to resist the de facto emergence of such regions in America, where the Constitution is not enforced. As we've seen, Europe is now riddled with what amount to no-go zones. As a practical matter, the laws of the land, including burqa bans, cannot be enforced there without the risk of precipitating violent unrest and calls for a defensive jihad, an invitation to attacks on the interest and people of any nation that might try to restore their sovereignty. Unless we act, this country will be next. Such no-go zones here, and the inevitable establishment within them of Sharia, would violate our founding document's Article 6, which defines the U.S. Constitution as, quote, the supreme law of the land, unquote, in America. Already, communities like Dearborn, Michigan, and others in, for example, Maine, Minnesota, and Tennessee, where Somali and other Muslim refugee populations have been settled, are manifesting signs of separatism and aggressiveness towards their non-Muslim neighbors that are precursors of the no-go zone phenomenon. So are compounds associated with a group styling itself Muslims of America, or Jamaat ul-Fuqra. The membership reportedly is predominantly made up of felons, converted to Islam in prison, perhaps by chaplains credentialed by al-Qaeda and Muslim Brotherhood operative Abdurrahman al-Amoudi. As documented in a film entitled Homegrown Jihad, Terrorist Training Camps Around the U.S., their cult-like leader is a Pakistani jihadist named Sheikh Mubarak Ali Jilani, the man Wall Street Journal reporter Daniel Pearl was en route to interview in 2002 when he was kidnapped and beheaded. In 2006, the Justice Department issued a report stating that Jamaat ul-Fukra, quote, has more than 35 suspected communes and more than 3,000 members spread across the United States, all in support of one goal, the purification of Islam through violence, unquote. Neither the Constitution nor the security of the United States can tolerate no-go zones in which Sharia, rather than the supreme law of the land, governs, thus contributing inexorably to the progress of the phased plan for our destruction from within. Federal prohibitions on such enclaves are in order, and local, state, and where appropriate, federal authorities should be responsible for enforcing fully the U.S. Constitution within Muslim and all other communities. It is imperative that we also stop President Obama's wrecking operation with respect to the national security capabilities of the United States. As we've discussed, these are among the ways in which President Obama's policies are eviscerating U.S. defense capabilities. Such measures depart dramatically from the time-tested practice Ronald Reagan called peace through strength. As has happened repeatedly in similar past circumstances of American weakness, they actually imperil peace. According to the U.S. Constitution, it is the first duty of the federal government to ensure that the nation has the means by which to protect its people against all enemies, foreign and domestic. These steps to weaken our national defense must be reversed, lest we not simply be incapable of dealing with present and emerging threats to our security and vital interests, but invite them. The American people, who will ultimately bear the price of President Obama's reckless disregard for their security, must insist upon a course correction, starting with congressional reviews of the damage being done to the common defense. As has been true throughout history, if we want peace, we must prepare for war. An investment in the rebuilding of long-neglected conventional and nuclear forces, abandoning of policies of appeasement and retreat, and re-establishing our reliability as an ally may appear costly in the short run. But the costs of failing to take such steps always prove far greater in national treasure and, more importantly, in American lives. Finally, as a nation, we must admit we are at war. Think of it as the war for the free world, since that is truly what is at stake: freedom, ours and that of our friends and allies in nations all over the world who share our commitment to it. We need strong defenses to protect us against many threats, here and abroad, but in a war like this, they will not be sufficient by themselves to defeat our enemies. We must adopt a strategy and commit our resources on what might be called an all-in basis that has proven necessary and effective in the past. Drawing on the insights of the first Team B, Ronald Reagan developed and, as president, executed an all-in strategy for defeating the last terrible totalitarian ideology we faced, Soviet communism. It focused on delegitimating the USSR, exploiting and exacerbating its many weaknesses, and neutralizing its few but important strengths. To these ends, Mr. Reagan employed with devastating effect various instruments of political and economic warfare, military measures, and intelligence techniques to bring about the demise of the Soviet Empire and the freeing of the countless millions who had been enslaved by its communist ideology. We must learn from President Reagan's experience with applying the insights of the original Team B and do the same with those of its successor, Team B2. The goal can be nothing less than a comparable victory over those who, like the communists of yesteryear, seek our destruction through the sort of strategic, steadfast, and sustained program aimed at discrediting, undermining, and prevailing over the communism with a God doctrine of Sharia. The object with respect to this doctrine must be to discredit it, undermine it, and eventually prevail over it. Without a blueprint for success and the expectation of what victory looks like in this war, America remains adrift and vulnerable. There are a number of measures that should be part of a Reagan-esque all-in strategy for defeating our time's totalitarian ideological threat. Most of this illustrative list is self-explanatory, but several items warrant a bit of explanation. Given the essential role Sharia plays in animating jihad, of both the violent and the civilization kinds, countering it must be at the heart of any successful U.S. strategy to win the war for the free world. A Reagan-style strategy would include the political equivalent of irradiating a cancer, namely the Sharia doctrine and those seeking to bring it here. In particular, we must focus on Sharia as the fault line between peaceable, tolerant Muslims who are not the problem and jihadist ones who are. Sensibly, we need to reward the former and punish the latter. Ronald Reagan worked to drive down the price of oil as a means of helping in the bankrupting of the Soviet Union. Ironically, to that end, he teamed up with the Saudis. Now, we must use the same technique to destroy the Saudi-dominated OPEC cartel that is bankrupting us and enriching the Sharia-adherent Muslims who seek to destroy the Dar al-Harb, the house of war, primarily what is known as the free world. Exploiting our own energy resources is necessary, but not sufficient. OPEC has historically responded to increases in our production of indigenous energy supplies by cutting back on their production, so as to maintain high prices. We must change the game. By utilizing methanol as a transportation fuel, it can be produced in great quantity at relatively low cost from natural gas and other feedstocks we have in abundant supply. A prestigious group of former national security officials, legislators, and industrialists have formed the U.S. Energy Security Council to endorse such an approach. Every effort must be made to operationalize their recommendations by adapting our transportation fleet and fuel infrastructure to offer consumers fuel choice. The Sharia-promoting Organization of Islamic Cooperation has become the single most powerful multinational bloc within the United Nations and around the world. That is not a positive development for this country and other freedom-loving people. We must do everything possible to expose, discredit, and delegitimate the corrupt and insidious agenda and practices of the OIC. The goal should be the group's dismantling, or at least its neutralizing as a political force, a measure that would be aided incalculably by obstructing its principal funding source, the oil revenue lifeblood that sustains the economies of its OPEC members. We must make a similar effort to neutralize the Muslim Brotherhood. President Reagan used a variety of instruments to challenge the legitimacy of the Soviet Union as an essential element of his strategy aimed at destroying it and breaking up its empire. We must do the same with the Muslim Brotherhood by exposing its true nature and that of its Sharia agenda, thwarting, not assisting, its efforts to obtain power elsewhere and blocking its penetration of our own country. At present, non-Muslim nations that are unfriendly towards the United States, if not currently our enemies, face few, if any, costs for helping Islamists wage jihad against this country and the rest of the free world. Perhaps in no other area are there more opportunities for an all-in strategy for countering Sharia and the jihad it impels than with respect to the assistance the Muslim Brotherhood, the Iranians, and other Islamists receive from states that do business with the United States. For this purpose, pages should be taken from President Reagan's playbook, starting with National Security Decision Directive 75, the once highly classified blueprint for the takedown of the Soviet Union. We have ways to exact costs from those who arm, underwrite, protect, and otherwise enable the jihadists and their sponsors, and, as necessary, we must utilize them against Putin's Russia, Communist China, and other dictators, like the Castro brothers in Cuba and Hugo Chavez in Venezuela. It's appropriate to conclude this course where we began, with an inspiring insight into the threat we face from Sharia and the need for concerted responses to it by our countrymen and women, as individuals, as members of organizations, and as citizens coming together in national efforts. Lieutenant General William Jerry Boykin, who co-led the Team B2 initiative, leaves us with this important call to action.
In 1776, the people in the colonies faced an all-or-nothing situation. It was either freedom or tyranny. They had to win the revolution. In World War II, the entire world faced the same choice, tyranny or freedom, as we defeated Imperial Japan and Nazi Germany. Today we're facing a threat that is probably as great as it was in 1776, and that is the threat from the Muslim Brotherhood and all its front groups in America. They pose a huge threat to our Constitution, to our way of life, to our future. Again, it's tyranny or freedom. Now is the time for Americans to wake up and act. We need to hold our members of Congress accountable for being truthful about the dangers posed by the Muslim Brotherhood in America. We need to hold leaders at all levels accountable. And as individual Americans, we need to understand just how serious this threat is, and each of us needs to get involved in turning this back and saying, our Constitution will stand. We will not live under tyranny.
You've now been exposed to an enormous amount of information about a threat that, as I said at the very outset, too few Americans are even aware exists. As a result of this course, we hope to have equipped you not only to understand the nature and implications of the totalitarian supremacist Islamist doctrine of Sharia. You've learned what to look for with respect to the Muslim Brotherhood, its front groups and other Islamist organizations and their enablers. In particular, you have been read in on what their various techniques are for insinuating Sharia into our country to the extreme detriment of women, other religious communities, homosexuals, apostates, artists, and the freedoms these groups and the rest of us enjoy under our Constitution. Finally, in this concluding part of the course, you've been given some concrete suggestions about how we as individuals, as members of organizations, and as citizens of this nation can help counter the threat of Sharia and the civilization jihad. We're of course under no illusion that doing so will be easy. Our enemies have a considerable head start in organizing to defeat us. And by using religion as a cover for what is fundamentally a subversive political program, they've already made great strides in destroying us from within by our hands. Still, we have as a nation done much harder things than this. President Ronald Reagan, who fought and defeated the previous totalitarian ideology, Soviet communism, initially by exposing its penetration of his film industry and trade union movement, has shown us the way. He's also given us direction that can inspire our own efforts now, in this moment of great peril. He said, quote, "Freedom is never more than one generation away from extinction. We didn't pass it on to our children in the bloodstream. It must be fought for, protected, and handed on to them to do the same, or one day we will spend our sunset years telling our children and our children's children what it was once like in the United States, where men were free." Unquote. Thanks for listening.